Yeah, thanks to my teammates. They were key today. We did an amazing stage. I just put my pace from the bottom, and then I just did the best I could.
Tadej Pogačar returns to the Vuelta a España, and that raises an obvious question inside his own team. For most of the last 2 seasons, UAE Team Emirates has deliberately kept him away from Spain in August, and not by accident. After his 2025 Tour de France win, the team sent an 8-man squad to the Vuelta without him, and the reasoning inside the sport was blunt. A roster stacked with riders capable of leading a Grand Tour on their own finally needed the chance to actually do it. So why reverse that logic now, in a year when the back end of the calendar is already loaded with the World Championships, Il Lombardia, and the European Championships on home soil in Slovenia? The answer says less about Pogačar's schedule than about what UAE is actually asking Joao Almeida to give up. If you're the kind of viewer who watches a Grand Tour and can't stop thinking about the rider who isn't winning, the domestique burning his legs off in service of somebody else's jersey, hit subscribe, because these breakdowns exist for exactly that kind of attention, the stuff that never makes the podium ceremony. That reversal is playing out now, on a bigger stage with a bigger name attached. UAE Team Emirates-XRG just confirmed its lineup for the 2026 Vuelta a España, and on paper, it reads like a murderer's row of Grand Tour talent. In practice, it's one job description with 8 names on it. Tadej Pogačar leads. That part isn't up for debate. It's the reason the announcement made headlines at all. He's returning to the Vuelta a España for the first time since 2019, chasing the Mayo Rojo, and UAE built a roster around him that includes João Almeida, Jay Vine, Pavel Sivakov, Pablo Torres, Kevin Vermaerke, Domen Novak, and Ivo Oliveira. Read that list slowly. That's not a support team. That's a start list for a different, smaller Grand Tour, all of them wearing the same jersey and pointed at the same single outcome. The team's own press release called it a formidable, balanced, experienced lineup, which is corporate language for bringing enough climbers to start a mountain range of their own. Sports directors Marco Marcato, Manuele Mori, and Tomasz Gil will spend 3 weeks steering 8 extremely talented cyclists toward the exact same conclusion the team already announced before a single pedal turned. It isn't only Almeida whose season gets folded into somebody else's. Jay Vine has led his own teams up mountains before and won Grand Tour stages doing it. Pavel Sivakov has spent a decade as one of the most technically complete climbers in the peloton, capable of running GC campaigns of his own at smaller stage races. Even Pablo Torres, the 22-year-old Spaniard making his Grand Tour debut at his own home race, in front of his own country, is walking straight into a team hierarchy where his job for 3 weeks is to disappear into the workload rather than chase his own headline. UAE didn't just build a strong team around Pogačar, they built a team stacked with riders who, on a different roster, in a different summer, would be leading Grand Tours of their own. Cycling has always had a name for this arrangement, the super-domestique, the rider good enough to win on his own, but employed specifically not to, and Almeida is walking into Spain as the most decorated version of that job title currently working in the sport. You can draw a straight line from Mikel Landa spending his prime years protecting Chris Froome at Sky, to Bradley Wiggins surrendering his own tour ambitions to the same team machine, to what Almeida is being asked to do now. The sport has quietly celebrated that role for decades, treating the sacrifice itself as a kind of honor, which is a comfortable story right up until you remember the sacrifice is somebody's actual career, not a plot device. The rest of the roster fills in the picture around them. Kevin Vermaerke is the versatile American who can climb, time trial, and cover breakaways, depending on what the day demands. Domen Novak and Ivo Oliveira round things out as the kind of durable, unglamorous riders who spend 3 weeks fetching, blocking, and pacing without ever appearing in a single headline, the sport's version of a stagehand who never gets thanked from the stage. Put all 8 of them together, and you have a team so deep that its 9th or 10th best rider would still headline most other squads in the race. None of that depth is really in question. What every bookmaker, every pundit, and every rival team already assumes going into Monaco is that Pogačar wins this race, barring a crash or a bad day. And that assumption is exactly what makes Almeida's role so strange to sit with. He isn't there to manufacture an unlikely victory. He's there to protect a near certainty. To make sure the strongest rider in the world doesn't lose a race everyone already expects him to win, which turns 3 weeks of genuine sacrifice into something closer to insurance than heroics. Here's where it gets interesting. UAE's official language around Almeida doesn't call him support. Multiple team statements, released within hours of each other, describe him as another genuine general classification option, fresh off what the team itself calls an outstanding season. He's the rider, on paper, capable of staying with Pogačar longest when the road tilts upward, and the watts per kilogram numbers that matter on summit finishes start separating contenders from companions, which is a polite way of saying he's the strongest possible bodyguard money can buy. Almeida also skipped the Tour de France entirely this year to arrive at the Vuelta a España rested, which is either a sign that UAE genuinely rates his chances or the most expensive taper block in the history of professional cycling, built entirely to protect somebody else's legs in week 3.
From DSM, well, now called Post Picnic NL, up there in the attack so often. He even told us afterwards today that he's going to try it again tomorrow for a moment.
And Almeida's resume actually backs up the genuine option language, which is what makes this so strange. Back in 2020, as a total unknown on his Grand Tour debut, he pulled on the leader's pink jersey at the Giro d'Italia and held it for the better part of 3 weeks. A run no other debutant had managed, before finishing 4th overall once the mountains finally caught up with him, in a race that went on to produce the closest Grand Tour finish in decades, decided by 39 seconds in the final individual time trial. Then, in 2025, he finished 2nd at the Giro d'Italia behind Primož Roglič, matching his FTP threshold against the best GC riders in the world, and coming up just short, which means his most recent Grand Tour result is a podium finish at cycling's toughest 3-week race. This is not a rider who fell into the sport as a domestique and stayed there out of habit. This is a rider who has led a Grand Tour on merit, who the peloton has watched control entire mountain stages under his own name, and who is now walking into Spain as the second best resume on his own team bus, because the first best resume happens to be the most dominant stage racer of his generation. To understand why this particular Vuelta a España means so much to Pogačar, you have to go back to 2019, his first ever Grand Tour. He was 20 years old, riding for UAE Team Emirates as essentially an unknown, and over 3 weeks, he won 3 separate mountain stages, finished 3rd overall, and took the Mayo Blanco as best young rider, racing with the kind of freedom you only get once, before anyone in the peloton has figured out how dangerous you actually are. It's the kind of debut that ends careers before they start, in the sense that nothing you do afterward can possibly top it. Except in Pogačar's case, he then went and won the Tour de France 5 times and the Giro d'Italia once, and somehow still had 1 gap left on the resume. The Vuelta a España is that gap. It's the only one of the 3 Grand Tours he's never won, and a win in Spain would make him only the 9th man in the sport's history to complete the full set, joining riders like Chris Froome, who completed a Tour de France and Vuelta double in the modern era, on a list that has very few names and very long memories. He isn't even the first of his rivals to close that particular gap this year. Jonas Vingegaard, his closest challenger for most of the last 5 tours, already finished his own collection back in the spring by winning the Giro d'Italia, becoming the most recent rider before Pogačar to complete all 3 Grand Tours. So this isn't really a side quest for Pogačar. It's the one remaining item on a very short, very exclusive list, and at 27, coming off a dominant Tour de France victory, he's finally decided the timing is right to go get it. That list matters more than a single trophy would. Winning all 3 Grand Tours is one of the oldest, hardest benchmarks in the sport, the kind of achievement that gets a rider's name mentioned in the same breath as cycling's greatest of all time debate for the rest of his career, regardless of what he does afterward. Vingegaard already claimed his spot on that list this spring. Every month Pogačar spends without it is a month the debate stays technically unsettled, and for a rider who has already rewritten most of the sport's other records, an unsettled debate is apparently worse than losing. The rider who beat him to that 2019 title is still racing, and he's coming back too.
And Primož Roglič, the Slovenians are on the scene. Independent for not even 3 decades.
Primož Roglič finished ahead of Pogačar that year to win the overall, and in 2026, he skipped the Tour de France entirely to focus everything on a record 5th Vuelta win, which would put him alone at the top of the all-time list, ahead of Roberto Heras, the Spanish climber who won 4 consecutive editions in the early 2000s and still holds the record today. So the two riders who shared a podium 7 years ago, one at the start of his legend and one already building his, are about to line up again at the exact same race, except now they're both trying to write the final chapter of a very specific story, and only one of them can. Pogačar wants to finish something. Roglič wants to be the last man standing on a list that has his name on it more than anyone else's. And the field around them isn't empty. Richard Carapaz, the Olympic champion and Giro winner, enters as one of the most dangerous GC threats in the race, the kind of rider who climbs on instinct and wins stages that should belong to somebody else. Enric Mas, the Spanish contender who knows every climb on this route better than most riders know their own training roads, will have his home crowd behind him every time the road points upward. Sepp Kuss, who won this race outright in 2023 in one of the most dramatic team hierarchy collapses in recent Grand Tour history, is the living proof that the script doesn't always follow the plan. Almeida, meanwhile, just has to make sure his own teammate wins before any of those stories can even happen. If breakdowns like this are the reason you watch cycling, subscribe now, because what follows is where it gets specific. Think about the job Almeida actually signed up for this August. He's not chasing a result of his own. He trained a full season, skipped one of the 2 biggest races in the sport, and arrived at the start line in Monaco with the explicit understanding that his best days in the mountains belong to somebody else's record book. That shape shows up outside cycling too. The project where you did the hardest part and somebody else's name ended up on the slide. Or the game where you set the perfect pass and somebody else gets the highlight reel. Or the year you trained harder than anyone on the team and still spent the season on the bench because somebody else was simply better. Almeida is doing that at altitude, on live television, for 3 weeks straight, and getting called a genuine general classification contender in the process, which might be the most polite demotion in professional sports. None of this is unique to one team either. Modern Grand Tour rosters have gotten so deep that half the peloton's best climbers are riding as expensive insurance policies for somebody else's ambitions. And fans have noticed the pattern for years. The forums light up every summer with the same argument: whether a rider with a genuine top 5 resume should really be spending his prime years as a windbreak. UAE just happens to be the team doing it, with the 2 riders whose stories collide hardest this particular August.
Strong that he can handle, managed 3rd place, and he commented on UAE's team ride, and I said, would it be great to have a team like that? He said, well, then wouldn't it be so interesting? It wouldn't be so challenging, and I wouldn't have to fight so much.
Being that windbreak has a job description, and it isn't glamorous. It means Almeida drops back to the team car for bottles, so Pogačar doesn't have to. It means he sits on the front through crosswind sections to keep the gruppetto from forming before anyone else can attack. It means if Pogačar punctures on a summit finish, Almeida hands over his own wheel and waits by the roadside while the cameras follow somebody else up the mountain. Every one of those moments is a small, specific sacrifice of his own race, repeated dozens of times across 3 weeks, and none of it shows up in a highlight package. The route doesn't make his job any easier. The 81st edition opens with an individual time trial in Monaco, then runs through France and Andorra before it even reaches Spain, covering close to 3,300 kilometers with 7 summit finishes and a second time trial along the way. The opening week already throws demanding tests at Font-Romeu and Aramón Valdelinares, and from there the route climbs through Alto de Aitana, Calar Alto, and La Pandera, before the whole race winds down in Granada 3 weeks later. The Vuelta a España's identity has always been built on walls like the Alto de Angliru, the kind of summit that doesn't appear on this year's route, but still defines what this race demands of riders who want the Mayo Rojo, and you can feel that DNA in the climbs that do make the cut. Every one of those summit finishes is a place where a team leader gets protected, which means those are the exact climbs where Almeida's own ambitions get quietly put on ice, stage after stage, for 3 weeks straight, while the cameras stay pointed at the man in front of him. 3 weeks, roughly 21 stages, one job, repeated on a loop from Monaco to Granada. And this is the part that should worry Almeida more than any single stage. He's 27 years old, the same age as Pogačar, sitting squarely in what should be his own physical prime as a Grand Tour leader. Every season he spends riding at the front for somebody else is a season he doesn't get back, and there is no guarantee UAE ever hands him a Grand Tour of his own to lead outright while Pogačar is still on the roster and still winning everything in sight. This isn't a new pattern for him inside this team either. Almeida signed with UAE the very next season after that Giro breakout, which means almost the entirety of his career at the sport's most dominant team has unfolded in the shadow of the rider now leading him into Spain. Year after year, his calendar gets built around whichever race Pogačar isn't targeting, which means the closest thing he has to guaranteed leadership is whatever 3 weeks his teammate decides to skip. It's the kind of arrangement that eventually pushes other riders to walk, to sign with a smaller team for a bigger role, and cycling journalists have already started asking, quietly, how many more seasons of genuine general classification option Almeida is willing to accept before he asks for the real thing somewhere else. Being the strongest possible teammate is a real skill, and it pays real money, but it is not the same career as being the strongest possible leader, and every rider in this sport knows exactly which one gets remembered decades later. That question about why Pogačar reversed course answers itself once you look at what the role actually costs. Skipping the Vuelta a España in 2025 wasn't really generosity, it was scheduling, and coming back in 2026 isn't cruelty, it's ambition. But the effect on Almeida lands the same either way. Whichever year, whichever excuse, his own leadership stays exactly one team decision away from happening. UAE will keep calling him a genuine option right up until the moment it actually matters, and then he'll be back on the front, shredding the group down to nothing for somebody else. The European Championships in Slovenia will still be waiting when this Vuelta ends. Almeida's own turn might have to wait a good deal longer than that. If breakdowns like this, the stuff buried underneath the headline result, are the reason you watch cycling in the first place, subscribe, because it's exactly what keeps this channel funded to keep digging past the press release and into what teams are actually asking their riders to do.